Since the beginning, humans have been making, suffering, and representing war. And with us, these activities have changed and evolved. Since the end of the Cold War, historians and critics have noticed that America's wars have been steadily sinking out of visibility, with the average American today being especially distant from America's military campaigns. We're here to ask why, and to help bring war back into focus.
Had there been no wars, I'm more of a Dionysian person. I would have liked to, write about erotica and other stuff, right? I love life. I love enjoying life, but then there is the reality, and so there is a sense of responsibility. Because
Sinan Antoon was born in Baghdad in 1967 to an Iraqi father and an American mother. He studied literature at the University of Baghdad before moving to the U.S. after the First Gulf War, where he would earn an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown and a PhD in Arabic literature from Harvard. Currently a professor at NYU, Antoon has created a stunning body of translated works, as well as widely translated Arabic novels and poetry collections that, among many things, explore the costs of war. In early 2023, we sat down to talk about his life and work and the legacy of the Iraq War as we approach 20 years since the start of the catastrophic US-led invasion and occupation.
he kind of developed a hatred to dictatorship and Saddam Hussein, just as a young kid, but then as an aspiring writer also, the stifling environment and everything. So I always wanted to leave the country because I didn't want to live under dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to do with the fact that also when I started writing seriously and wanting to publish, at that time, the Iraqi regime with all of its resources had, complete control of culture, and it was during the Iran-Iraq war where all cultural production was geared towards glorifying the war effort against the Iranians and glorifying the leader, father leader, quote unquote, and the great majority of the writers, wrote in that vein in various degrees. This is in the pre-digital age when there was no place to publish except newspapers and journals. And I was dying to get my name out, but I, thankfully, if I may say so, decided that I'd rather not take part in this whole carnival of glorifying dictatorship. And the only pieces I published were, I sent something to an Arabic language publication that was published in Paris at the time. So it's basically also wanting to not live under dictatorship, but also wanting to go out and write and be free. And also kind of, at 22, I didn't want to wanted to leave the family, although my parents were both. My mom passed away in 89 and my dad in 1990, but I'd always wanted to kind of just leave and be on my own and explore. And coming to Washington, D.C. in particular, and in 1991, and I keep saying and writing about how, writing that in Arabic and in English for the benefit of the Iraqis and Arabs and Americans as well, too, that's such an important moment, 1991, for as you said, but in terms of understanding the destruction of Iraqi society and what it means. Because, around 2002 and 2003 and afterwards, people are like, oh my God, I can't understand what's happening in Iraq. Why is there all this chaos and whatnot? And if you go back and understand what 1991 meant and what the sanctions did, then it would all not seem so, it demystifies everything. But for me, being in Baghdad in 1991 and surviving the first Gulf War, being bombed for 6 weeks around the clock, there was no electricity, there was no water, there was nothing, and to use Jim Baker's words, we bombed them back to the pre-industrial age. And I was, like many Iraqis, against the invasion of Kuwait, and not a fan of Saddam Hussein,
Right.
and didn't wanted the Iraqi army to be out of Kuwait, but it was an opportunity for the United States to heal the wounds of Vietnam, and Saddam Hussein gave the US the Gulf on a platter of gold, because it was the US dream to have an excuse to have military bases in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
So invading Kuwait provided all of that, but seeing the country, and despite irrespective of my position on Saddam Hussein,
Mm-hmm.
the country had a very developed infrastructure. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we had some of the best infrastructure in the Middle East, best water treatment plants. Literacy was 97%, and 91 was about not only ejecting Saddam out of Kuwait, but actually bombing Iraq back to the pre-industrial age. So when I come to the US and I watch the footage on CNN, that was such an important moment for me, even as a writer later, to realize it's very simple, it's even cliche-ish, but there is this discourse that was fed to the world. It was the first TV war.
Yeah.
But the civilians were completely absent, and people were identifying with the bomber. But also the discourse in the media in describing the bombing, on CNN, it's like, oh, Baghdad lit up like a Christmas tree.
Mm-hmm.
Or then reading later, seeing some of the signs that were greeting US troops as they were going to Iraq and Kuwait, was one of them I remember, kick their ass and get their gas.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States imposed sanctions on Iraq to force it to leave Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
And the sanctions did not work, so the US invaded Iraq. The sanctions were kept in place.
Right.
And throughout the 90s, and I received letters from family and from friends, this is what really destroyed the social fabric of Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And drove 3 million mostly middle-class Iraqis to leave Iraq
Mm-hmm.
and end up everywhere, from Alaska to New Zealand,
Mm-hmm.
and change the dynamics of Iraqi society, and probably contributed to the rise of, definitely, made Iraq a very polarized society, and created a fertile space for all kinds of so-called fundamentalisms and radicalisms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying this so that people
Yeah.
understand that
Yeah.
this is another subject, but you don't need to read anything about Islamic history or Islamic texts to understand ISIS. You just need to look at the last 30 years, just like with...
Mm-hmm. And for you, that's like a key inflection point, 1991. Yeah. And
or
just
the same thing, it's what Mahmoud Mamdani calls culture talk. To understand Al-Qaeda and Taliban and terrorism, you don't need to read any religious text, you just need to look at the last 35 years.
Mm-hmm.
And look at foreign policy, look at history and politics, not look into culture. It has nothing to do with culture.
That's like, I am not the first person to say, like, this is just an extraordinary work of literature. Deeply moving, love story, coming of age story, war story, also very sexy. But it is.
I have to say, the editor at Yale University Press, I keep trashing him. He's like, there's too much sex in this novel. I was like, well, who decides
I enjoy
what's
it.
too
And I should say, all of it stands out to me, but like beyond just masterful storytelling and your style, it is that Jawed.
Mm-hmm.
Am I pronouncing his name right? Yeah, Jawed. That character, by the time I got to the end of this book, I felt like I knew his mind, like I knew his heart.
Mm-hmm.
I was with him on this emotional, psychological struggle to be numb and then to care, and that, to try to remember people's face. I mean, just so intense. And that character and that point of view is, of the many things that grabbed me, but that is like, has stayed with me. Could you share a little bit about how you developed him and that point of view, and just the choice to even be in this first person?
Yeah, I had written and published that first novel, which was about a prisoner under Saddam Hussein, and then, as I said, throughout the sanctions, but then the 2003 invasion and destruction, and it was so overwhelming because there was so much death in Iraq, especially with the so-called civil war, and I was trying to find which I think all writers, depending on the context, like what's the entry point? Like how, I myself as an Iraqi living in the diaspora, but also living in this country, seeing all this death and destruction, and where do I start? Because it can become overwhelming and you can fall into paralysis because there are tons. There are tons of stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like with grad school. Some of my colleagues were like, I don't have a topic. And I was like, I have 7 topics. The challenge is which one to go with. And I was lucky in that. But and as I said before, I think even early on in Iraq and during the Iran-Iraq war, I was always thinking of the civilians. And I'm addicted to the news always, all the time. And with the invasion and before, I was always clipping things from the New York Times and from elsewhere, and making archives and collecting material, and then so that feeds into the other one.
Yeah.
But I was just reading the newspaper one morning, the New York Times, and I saw this story about a corpse washer, which was really moving and made me cry because it was about a corpse washer who was making so much money, but he couldn't take it anymore, and he was going to quit and leave the country because he didn't want his son to inherit. Mm-hmm. And right away, I had that gut feeling whereby this, first of all, this is one of the few professions where you have to confront death and can't look away.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found this same story in Arabic, and then I thought somehow, this is such an amazing, such a rich character.
Mm-hmm.
And I was shocked that I'd never come across anyone in Arabic who had written about it. So right there I decided and started to make the changes, whereby, because having a character who confronts death every day is going to be so rich and would allow me to get into so much. And then I right away made the changes whereby wanted someone who had lived that period of all of the changes, because these 20, 30 years from going from dictatorship, and also because I had read so much and heard from so many Iraqis, and I've been haunted also by, the millions of people, not in Iraq, but elsewhere also, who just are talented and are very hardworking, but their dreams are destroyed by history, right? So the violence of history. And I think probably living in this country where the reigning ideology is if you just work hard enough, you're going to make it. But I'm always haunted by, the thousands of people around us who work very hard and are very talented, but also there are structural limitations. Mm-hmm. So right away after reading the story, I went and checked, and there was nothing written in Arabic about this kind of character. But also was enamored with the rituals. They sounded so poetic and so beautiful, and even though I'm an atheist, but I love rituals of all different religious traditions because they're so aesthetically rich. And then things started to develop, and I think looking back that all the reading and all the thinking that I had internalized in the previous 10 years all came into the narrative. So I also added this dimension to represent this strong strand in Iraqi society of people who were secular and non-sectarian. Also the loneliness of someone in a country that's going in a certain direction where sectarian identities are dominant, where he or she are not that. So it just adds to the alienation.
I wonder if you've ever thought about writing from the point of view of a U.S. soldier or of a Iraqi soldier.
Yeah, ideally I would want to, but frankly the deficit is so huge.
Yeah.
The deficit is so huge that it's going to take a lifetime to scratch the surface of civilians. And the reason why I mentioned is that from the Iran-Iraq war, because that was like, where the propaganda in Iraq is, of course, urging citizens to identify with the soldiers, and that was not a volunteer army, and people were being conscripted. But I was always thinking of the civilians, and that it's always about the marginalized and who is not in the story, and who is so. There's a huge problem in literary culture in this country. Even those who try, the vet writers, and this is going to be a generalization.
I know, I'm generalizing too.
No, because I'll be honest with you, I don't read writings of vets. It angers me so much.
Okay.
But even those who try to humanize Iraqis, the humanity extends to the translator because he works with us, right? And the humanity extends to those who are also the victims of the terrorism that we are fighting. And I think you can see it's really sad, but so much of literary culture is a reflection of official culture. I wrote just one article about Brian Turner's poetry.
Yeah.
So, right? So that poetry is considered anti-war poetry, just like the Hurt Locker film. There was an event at NYU where my colleague was thinking it's an anti-war film. It's actually a pro-war film. So that's the level of collective brainwashing and how militarized our society is, and how we've internalized settler colonial narratives. And so yes, and you see it in the policy. So leaving Afghanistan, we gotta bring the translators because they worked with us and they helped us with. What about everyone else? I would want to, in the future, if I have time, to explore a soldier or actually a collaborator, an Iraqi who is forced, and don't get me wrong, is forced by material reasons to work with. This is a huge issue. But I'm still having to deal with kind of the characters that haunt me that are... No, it's important to explore all of that. But again, there are commitments, conscious or unconscious. And this issue of the civilians and the soldiers for me is very important. That there cannot be an equivalence between civilians and soldiers. Because simply, and as I said, this is a volunteer army. It's not a conscription. And I understand that, of course, most people who go to the army are themselves victims of racial capitalism, of the system here. We know who ends up going. But the civilians, they don't choose to be in a war zone. This gets us to the whole notion of war zone. How does a country become a war zone? And so the lives of Iraqis who are not translators or who don't work with the US Army are completely expendable. They don't even register. I mean, at the beginning of the war, Tommy Frank said, we don't do body counts.
Right.
The only place where you can actually get numbers of Iraqi civilians who died is a website called Iraq Body Count, which started by a Turkish and a British academic. But thinking of this country and its own racial dynamics, sadly, none of this is surprising because, and I will just mention one thing. In the first few weeks of the occupation of Iraq, one of these embedded journalists, and this brings me to what I call embedded poetry and embedded creative writing. I mean, of course, people can get out of it. A journalist was going out with some U.S. troops in Baghdad to going outside of the camp. Yes.
Okay,
And the soldier, once they got out of the camp and they were in Baghdad, the soldier said, "This is Indian country." And that would have been a moment where the journalist should ask the soldier, "What do you mean by Indian country? Where does that term come from?" Charlie Rose, that was the forum for serious critical discussion. But after 5 years, Charlie Rose thought, things were going so badly, of course, people forget.
Right.
Maybe it's time to listen to a few Iraqis. So they had me and some other guy who was a fixer for journalists. But Charlie Rose was completely shocked by what I was saying, which was all just very common sense. But he was like, "Are you telling me that we did nothing good in Iraq?" And that question was so telling because it's how could it be that we, whatever that we means, went there and nothing good happened? It's like, no. Why would you expect that a war would bring anything positive? And people forget how difficult or impossible it was to be against the war in the first few years here. What's the name of this band?
The Dixie Chicks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, when they spoke out. I know. I mean, it's crazy to me to think about how we got from the late 60s to here.
Exactly.
I mean, what?
But that's what the Pentagon did with I think 91 and with this war, this whole evil but genius notion of embedded journalism. I mean, even if you're a critical person in a war, if you're with, this side and you're being shot at, I mean, who are you going to identify with?
Yeah.
That's why there's very little independent journalism. And then I have to tell you this story. Says the person about the embedded journalism, not even embedded. So when we were filming the documentary in Baghdad in July, we were busy filming every day, but I had met this American journalist in Cairo a few months before, and then she happened to be in Baghdad. And so she emailed me, she's like, if you guys want to come visit us, I'm staying in this compound with American journalists. And it was July, 3 months after, and then she gave me directions to her house where they were staying. And I understand, like, being in a foreign city, but it was on the other side of the city, on the other side of the river. She didn't even know which part of the city she was in. That's one problem, minor problem. Then we go, and at the time, was the beginning of chaos, but there was, not a lot of electricity. Iraqis were like, what's going to happen? It's 3 months after the invasion. It's hot. But I go to the compound where this person from the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times folks, and it's a compound in a posh neighborhood in Baghdad that has generators and has electricity 24 hours a day. And has a swimming pool, and they have whiskey and wine, and that's really great. I understand, they don't have to suffer. But the problem is if they don't get out, they don't realize. And then we're there, and then she says, I'm writing a story about the Iraqi constitution. I was like, what? She's like, yeah, she's like, in America, constitution, blah, 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 I am an immigrant family. And I was like, we had met hundreds of Iraqis in the last 2 weeks. And not a single one of them talked about the constitution. They were talking about safety, security, electricity, water. But then it dawned on me, like, she's thinking completely like, what's the most important thing in the US for her? Constitution. But anyway, and they don't get out. And so later I would understand completely. And I mention this because throughout the years of the occupation, most of what gets published in the US is people who go to the green zone. I was always saying, to my partner and to my friends, every morning or every other day we wake up in the morning and they say on NPR, things are good in Afghanistan, we're making progress. And then everyone was shocked about the catastrophe, and then there's this hasty. And so where was the critical journalism? Where is the critical discussion? How is it that no one really knew what was happening in those 20 years, right? Where was the critical journalism? So I always think of what Amy Goodman said once, which stayed with me, which is really brilliant, because she said, we don't have state media in this country because the corporate media does the job, which is totally true. I mean, throughout the war with Iraq or Afghanistan, the spectrum, when you get a discussion, a panel of 3 people discussing the war, you have the CNN expert who's a retired general, which I understand. What kind of perspective are they going to give you? They're retired. And then you have someone who is currently in the army, and then you have a journalist who's like, having some qualms about it, whereas European media has its own problems, of course, but at least there, for example, you would get an anti-war activist to it. So the spectrum here is so limited. And the same thing applies to the race problem in this country. So it took George Floyd for people like, oh my God, we have a problem. Is that what it took to understand? So it's this, it's a bit pessimistic.
Yeah, it feels like Abu Ghraib could have been George Floyd, but it wasn't.
No, and even the response to Abu Ghraib shows the Eurocentric Orientalism, because at the time it was all about, this is horrible because Arab men don't like to be forced to wear underwear and be taken pictures of.
Right.
And it was like, which men in which culture do really enjoy not feeling humiliated? But I give you a concrete example. So at the time I was teaching a course called The Body in the Arabic Tradition, which just takes the body as a category from pre-Islamic times all the way to the modern times, and how the body functions in literature, in religious discourse, and so on and so forth. And it was the time of Abu Ghraib, and at the time this book had come out that this guy had found all these collections of photographs of lynchings that people had collected and that had sent as postcards. And I just thought that actually by showing the students the fact that bodies of black men mostly were, violence was committed against them, but that was a spectacle to which entire families went and watched. I thought that they would make the connection that Abu Ghraib, one way of looking at it is that in the colonies sometimes, what you can no longer do in the metropolis, you do in the colonies. But none of them were able to make the connection. Because a lot of them were actually shocked about the lynchings themselves. They didn't know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I find that.
We go again to another problem is that, race is addressed in passing, but not. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I remember at the time in that class, a student said we live in a post-race society, and I was like, there was a time when I was really enamored with post-structuralism, and I learned so much. But I told her then, maybe I'm getting old, but I'm like very suspicious of post anything. yeah. There is no post. It's an aspirational post, hopefully.
This idea of post actually brings me maybe to my last question about the corpse watcher, and then just a few on the book of collateral damage too. But so, and you kind of already mentioned this, that it ends with a reference to Benjamin and the angel of history. And then when I was reading that, I was like, that the line I think is history is random and violent, storming and uprooting everything and everyone. And I'm just like picturing the Benjamin there. And then in the book of collateral damage, that's your notes.
Yes.
I mean, he is your guy, and if you could just say. But what's different about the end of the corpse washer is we get the pomegranate and the nightingale, and to me that feels different than just a pile of wreckage.
Yes. No, that's an important point. There is, so much focus in the writings, even in Arabic, or in the responses are like the catastrophe that Jawad has to face every day. But at the end, he comes to the realization that life and death are intertwined, and there is the reality that he goes on. He senses that there is a responsibility. Someone has to wash the dead and accompany them on that last journey, and he comes to appreciate what his father was doing, and he goes on. So there is this sense of resilience. He realizes that he has to do that job, right? So there is a glimmer of hope or of continuing to go on until things change. But in the book of collateral damage, it's circular. We go back to the beginning because it's darker in that there is, it's impossible to fully chronicle the destruction. So, but Benjamin, I worship him.
About his death.
I just once I read him way back, but the more time passes, I'm not alone. So many people are. But it's just that these essays, I assign them to in every class I teach, no matter what, because he somehow captures the essence of how history functions, and also the fact that barbarism and civilization are not two separate zones. That's I think the realization at the end of the corpse washer. Jawad understands that it extends to our species being on this planet, that somehow we feed on the death of other beings, unfortunately, as he and his father. That was his initial problem, right, with the pomegranates, that he realizes that they make their living out of the death of other humans, but also the pomegranate
Right.
is fed by water coming from washing the dead. But I was going to go back to Benjamin saying there is no document of civilization which is not simultaneously a record of barbarism. As recently, for example, the new assault ship is going to be called Fallujah, the one that the US is building,
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
to honor those who fought in the Battle of Fallujah. But
Wow.
Fallujah is also the place where the United States used white phosphorus and these other weapons that are producing on a daily basis all kinds of defects in children being born there.
Mm-hmm.
And it just shows you the level of what I've been talking about. That also the notion, even the history of the Battle of Fallujah, if you ask most people now, they tell you, well, it started when the Iraqis killed contractors. But actually, it started before that, when there was a peaceful demonstration and Iraqis were shot and killed. So, but then again, with war, it's always like that.
I wonder if you could share a bit about how you arrived at this kind of form and method. In particular, I mean, so we're going on this journey with Namir, and then also we're getting this archive. Yeah.
I mean, I think I sometimes I don't know, but I try to think of all where it started. But during the '91 war, when the bombing started, we had to go and stay in the basement of a restaurant. I mean, one of the trips back, a missile had fallen, and a U.S. missile had fallen on a couple of houses. And we just stopped to see, and I just kind of saw that two houses were completely destroyed. And I just kind of had the thinking about, what is a house or what is a home? Is all of the network of all of the objects and everything that you have and all of these things. That's what is a life. And it's also trying to decenter humans at the end of the day, because if they're counted, it's only humans that are counted. But then in other contexts, I was always haunted by the refugees who have to leave everything behind. And frankly, also watching what happens in Israel and Palestine, because there's this house demolition always, which continues, it's ongoing. And you see a family that are told that their house will be destroyed in half an hour, and then they have to leave, and then they watch a bulldozer completely destroy the house. And I just think of, when we move to a new place, we have these things that we put around, the paintings and all that. So this is what also part of our network of lives. And in just trying to think of the destruction that takes place, and always also been haunted not only by what was actually killed, but what could have been but was killed. So you have it in that the two girls, one of whom was going to become a famous pianist, but she was killed. Thinking, how do you chronicle what war destroys, not just human beings, but everything else? And then I think also Benjamin, somewhere where he writes about works of art, but I extended it to other objects, where he says that works of art have a life of their own. But I have to credit poetry as a poet, and all the old ancient Arabic poetry that I love and read, is that there is this so much stress on every little object to be described, including animals. And the central topos in all of these old Arabic odes was that the poet, because they lived in nomadic societies and they had to always move, but the poet would see the remains where his beloved's tribe had been living, and they had you can see the remains of where there was life before, and the poet stands and sheds a few tears, and then his two actual or imaginary companions tell him it's time to move on. But there's this notion of describing the remains. But later, critics were saying that it's just not actual necessarily real ruins, but it's a metaphor about time and what time does to nature and to humans.
And you're like, it's both.
Yeah, and then I keep saying I am an atheist because I am, but I love mystical poetry, and in mysticism there is, mostly that I read in Arabic, there's this notion of that everything around us is alive, and that if we just listen carefully, it's really beautiful. Going back to aesthetics, that all objects have a life of their own, and actually linking it to a lot of indigenous cultures where there was a different relationship to nature and to all beings. There was more. There wasn't a predatory relationship, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That makes you, think of, I think in the book of Collateral Damage, you have this line where the Namir is thinking about his students, how they believe in the logic of war. Somehow maybe that's opposing the logic of war. I don't know.
I mean, definitely it is. I mean, in writing these books, I've also come to realize how, we're all complicit in the way we live, and how, indirectly we're all complicit in this larger system of destruction, and also understanding different, I don't know, I forgot her name, but one of was it Lucille Clifton or someone else who said, there's a war going on in the streets of America, depending on your class and race. So it's that war is not just the war that begins and ends officially. I've always been also haunted by the notion of how wars don't end, and wars end for the victors, who have their parades and go on to reap the rewards, monetary or otherwise. But even the vets that I see here in New York who are homeless, I mean, that's why when with the Iraq War, when they say we lost the war, actually the warmongers and the Dick Cheneys and others, they didn't lose the war. The Dick Cheney's portfolio tripled after the war because
But at one point in The Corpse Watcher, Namir gestured towards linking the Saddam regime and the American occupation, so the sectarian civil war, and the US-led invasion. And that's one thing I think your work does very successfully. And I wonder if you feel that way, that you've achieved that, showing how these things are intersecting. In some ways you've already talked about this today too. But.
No, that's a great question. Yesterday I was talking to someone about that. We were talking about the responses of a lot of leftists to wars and this binary approach to things. You're either, it's kind of the Bush thing, you're either with us or against us. But, sorry, the world is more complicated. So to me, whether the 91 war, I mean, later when I left I realized that a lot of people or writers in opposing the US war, they would give a blind eye to the crimes of dictatorship. And I was telling this friend yesterday, it just seems that most people feel more comfortable with the binary. So yes, I was one of those who was always against the Saddam dictatorship. My first novel is all about that. And in 2002, sadly most people don't know this, but about 450 Iraqi intellectuals, writers and artists and people living in the diaspora, most of whom were victims of Saddam Hussein's regime, signed a petition that said no to dictatorship and no to war, and said that if this war takes place, it will spell disaster for the region, and it will not improve the condition of Iraqis, and it would cost hundreds of thousands of deaths. And none of us were geniuses, actually. Didn't need to be a genius. And this continues. So yes, this is one thing. This is my position, that you can be anti-imperialist. It doesn't mean that then you are uncritical when it comes to dictatorship and totalitarianism, because they are intertwined. But I also grew up as a teenager drinking tea in our living room, watching on the TV Donald Rumsfeld being the emissary of President Reagan, visiting Baghdad to deliver a message to Saddam Hussein. So US-Iraq relationships were very good in the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein was a vicious dictator and when he was decimating Iranians, because at that time Iraq served the purpose of US and its Gulf allies in being, weakening Iran. And back then Henry Kissinger said, the longer this war lasts, the better for us. So for me, when then Donald Rumsfeld appears again, all of a sudden being a champion of Iraqi human rights, I'm also burdened by memory that I can remember, and that I know that the United States foreign policy, the United States is not a charity, it's an imperial power, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sadly, so many fellow citizens confuse whatever,
Mm-hmm.
idealized notions of the national myth with foreign policy.
Bring up your buddy Brian Turner. So, in an interview about his memoir about serving as an occupier in Iraq, Turner said, quote, "I was an occupier and invader. Being a part of this mighty military apparatus imposes a power dynamic on the story. I believe that some child whose door I kicked in will have more to tell us about the war than anything I could say. We don't yet have that witness. Over the years, hopefully, we will learn more." And so this sense in his quote that we need Iraqi witnesses strikes me as right and valid and in line with your own work, but it also makes me think of something I believe you've called a forensic interest in Arabic literature and culture. And there's a moment in the book of Collateral Damage where the professor character is confronted with an ROTC student in the Arabic language course at Dartmouth. It was just a harrowing moment.
Which is an actual moment that took place.
I suspected. So in that moment I could see this, but I wonder if you could say more about that problem, and maybe specifically if as a professor now at NYU, you find that students and faculty, because you include moments of that too, but others just have this kind of forensic interest in Arabic literature, Arabic culture, or see you personally as someone who could explain everything.
Yes, definitely.
And
we have a problem whereby only one person is enough to tell you about all of them. That's the other problem. That's enough.
And
so
you feel that as with your students about
but the problem with that quote from Mr. Turner is exactly, and it's a general problem that has to do with the global South or Arabic literature or cultural production from other parts of the world. It's not taken as primarily artwork or literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's always an anthropological or sociological aspect to any work of literature, but and also it's this notion, the problematic notion, just like with the issue of race or gender in this country, let's just bring one or, diversify bringing. It's it doesn't really change the dynamic because, there is something called the political economy of literature in this country whereby how are we gonna read the narrative of the little Iraqi boy whose house door he kicked? That boy has to write in English and has to get into the network of publishing in this country. If he or she or they write in Arabic, who's going to translate it? Because I know also about translation. So there is this whole network, there are all these obstacles and structural problems. But there is the problem of considering the cultural production of the global South or others as something of value just to extract information from. It's not appreciated for its artistry or beauty. Even when it is, it's always, so Royce Crampton, one of the writers you mentioned, he reviewed my work and Hassan Balasem, and he's like, oh, this is the Iraqi Kafka, and that's the Iraqi Beckett, and and I adore Beckett, adore Kafka, but we're not, no one likes to be a copy of someone else. But the problem is rampant in academia, even when we discuss hirings or deficits or what we should cover. So it's, I was hired, the position was called non-European pre-modern culture. That was one person who would cover all of that. And even despite all of the changes and all of the fights that my colleagues are fighting, we still have, we have 5 people teaching Shakespeare and 20 people whose area is Europe or all versions of Europeans, and when it's Europe there is time, and then there's one person teaching all of Africa. So it's a huge problem. I should mention, in all fairness, that there is a vet who fought in Fallujah, Ross Capote, who to my mind is kind of the perfect example of someone who has a conscience, who has an ethics, because he realized afterwards that he was forced to be part of this huge killing machine that destroyed the city of Fallujah. And he has written a book, and he has this whole project about rebuilding Fallujah. So just as we have people who refuse to fight, we have to remember that it's not inevitable that everyone has to fight. But there is a problem with Mr. Turner's and others' discourse. It's like, and it's the old age colonial mentality that these places are about adventure, you know, adventure. So the interesting thing I think for him is that he went to a creative writing program and then volunteered to go to Iraq, right? But yeah, and I should say, sadly, a lot of Iraqis internalize this notion. So initially, when he published his collection of poems, and did you read the article I wrote about his collection of poems? I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, the cover, the way they chose the cover, it's just so telling.
Yeah, yeah.
To erase, goes back to what I'm saying, erase the Iraqis, whose heads were covered with hoods, right? And just leave the strong American man against nature. And those who happen to be in nature. But actually, so he publishes his collection of poems. Some Iraqi translator translates them to Arabic. This is way back, like 12 years ago. And I just saw it on Facebook saying, like, you know, imagine this. A soldier occupying your country. Why are you in a rush to translate his poetry when we have yet to take stock of like the narratives of all of the Iraqis who've been displaced and who've been killed? So of course this guy is like, oh, it's so sad that you are a professor in American University, but you're against cultural communication. And I'm like, what cultural communication? But then it's so great because years later, Brian Turner sends me an email. He's like, he was asked, of course, by a journal to edit a special issue on the war, and that he knows from his Iraqi friends that I have critiques of his poetry, and he welcomes that. But he's inviting me to participate in the... So it's also the vets, it's perfect because those who wage the war, also they curate how war is going to be representative. And again, I'm not belittling the suffering of soldiers and how they are forced to go there, but how it's all geared towards, again, we go back to the deficit and the equivalence. So now when you have a panel, so I was just invited to a panel by Scranton, but I didn't respond.
Oh, right, interesting, yeah.
He's going to have something on the anniversary of the war. So he has 3 American journalists and academics, and then 3 Iraqi writers. It's also that the Americans provide the analysis and the Iraqi writers give the emotions. It's like, and I don't consider myself an analyst or whatever, but I've written about 15 essays in English about the war. So
you're like, I guess I can wear that hat.
But the Ross Capote, who's in Boston, is really an interesting figure too. He went back and he did a PhD, but he's really working hard on this whole reconstruction of Fallujah. You know what I mean? We had sorry, I'm like, even in Israel, there is this whole movement of refuseniks, the soldiers who refuse to go and take part in the military, and a lot of them go to prison. There are documentaries about them. It just seems that, I'm sure there are in this country, but of course they don't get enough space to be out there, right? Because it doesn't...
It's January 5th, 2023. 5 days into the new year, and this March will be the 20 years after the invasion and occupation, and I'm sure there's going to be, you just mentioned you've been invited to one already, and I'm sure there are going to be at universities and different kind of events to like commemorate 20 years. In some sense, people think that war is over, especially with now, in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there's this sense that maybe now it's like, we're looking back. And so I wonder how you think about looking, at this year, 20-year mark, what maybe that means to you, or what's on your list for this? I don't know.
I have to resist the temptation to just kind of keep saying, I told you so, but I just want to, because I'm remembering these days, like in 2002, how so many of us and I went around the East Coast with two members of 9/11 victims' families, a Hiroshima survivor and an Afghani American woman, going around the East Coast, synagogues, universities, churches, saying there shouldn't be war. And I just said there will be no weapons of mass destruction. A lot of Americans will die, many more Iraqis will die, and then we'll all say, oh, why did this happen? What could we have done? But I think I'm just gonna, I don't know, I'm just gonna say, you know, something I learned from Toni Morrison, who says about how in America, Americans like just to talk about the future because they don't want to confront the past. And you know what you said, you know, Iraqis and Afghanis and others live with the effects of those decisions. And the problem is all the people who made the decisions and all the pundits who supported them are all still around us. And they keep going on. You know, in our profession in academia, you make that many mistakes, you get fired, right? You can't fuck up that often. These people keep fucking up and come back to give us more wisdom. And with that, the Trump administration was horrible because all of the warmongers were brought back because they're not as terrible as Trump, right? But I don't know what to say. I think I'm going to actually focus on the linkages between all of the issues that citizens in this country have to contend with about how this country came about and who pays the price for what this country does. But what is there to say? I'm going to sound like an old man because it's been 20 years. But I guess I will focus on, just to resist the erasure and the falsification, is that, you know, there was an anti-war movement, was strong in San Francisco and here, but not strong enough. And we should remember that more than half of the population was for the war. And the question is why? Why are so many Americans pro-war, almost intuitively? And maybe link it to why so many Americans are pro-police. Because the other disheartening thing is that, you know, we had these 3-4 months after George Floyd where people were questioning, and I read in the New York Times that now we're back to normal because we, most of us, cannot confront the past. So, last thing I'll say, when we were showing this documentary around the country, people would come up to me and say, oh, you know, well-meaning citizens, we have to also mention that, who are against all of this. And they're like, what can we do? And I would just say the next time the government comes and tells you we have to go destroy country for weapons, just remember.